Thank you, Chairman Cirrus, and thank you for sharing your personal story as well. Thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I especially want to thank Ms. Rosa Maria Paya. Rosa Maria, we applaud your courage in the face of tyranny. The testimony we're about to hear from her is from a courageous individual whose family has been permanently scarred. On July 22nd, it will be 9 years since her father, Oswaldo Paya, and his colleague, Harold Shapiro, were extrajudicially killed by the Cuban regime. He was a brave man and regretfully joins the ranks of many others who've died at the hands of the regime and under suspicious circumstances. Last Sunday was a momentous and an inspirational day. Tens of thousands of Cubans all throughout the country took to the streets demanding freedom from the communist dictatorship. Some even waved the American flag as they demanded libertad. Since 1959, Cuban people have been trapped by the iron grip of Fidel Castro, his brother, and its hand-picked successor. Despite brutal and violent crackdowns from the regime, many courageous Cubans continue demanding their God-given right to liberty and democracy, something 3 generations and millions of Cubans have been deprived of. Let's be clear. This is not about COVID-19. This is not about the embargo. What are the Cuban people shouting in the streets? Libertad. Cubans are sick and tired of being oppressed, and they are in the streets openly and bravely demanding an end to communism. Even prior to these recent protests, anti-regime sentiment has steadily increased in the country. In November, the communist regime broke up a hunger strike led by the San Ysidro movement, a collective of artists, musicians, writers, and scholars. This led to a large protest by hundreds of artists and activists in front of the regime's Ministry of Culture. These protests have been dubbed by some observers as an awakening of civil society in Cuba, and it sure looks that way. A new generation is rising up, and they want to live in freedom. I am in awe of the courage of the Cuban people and the many risks they take protesting the violent and brutal dictatorship. We must not ignore the dangers they face. An untold number of peaceful protesters and activists remain imprisoned. Demonstrators risk jail, degrading treatment, torture, even death, all for liberty. Additionally, the communist regime uses Chinese technology to block and censor internet service and disrupt communications across the island. These violations of basic human rights are absolutely unacceptable. We must demand action. This is a crisis that requires a bipartisan response. And Chairman Cirrus, I know this issue hits home for you, and I know you hear, as no one else can, the Cuban people's cries for liberty and dignity. Holding the communist regime accountable for its repressive policies while supporting the people's quest for freedom and democracy is crucial. I hope we can prioritize this issue for the good of all Cubans and for the good of the Western Hemisphere at large. The Cuban people have never experienced the kind of self-government and freedom that many Americans take for granted. As the freest and most prosperous nation in the world, the United States must unequivocally stand with the Cuban people against the communist regime. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and Cuba has never been closer. When will the Cuban people finally be free? When people of faith are no longer afraid of arbitrary detentions, threats, and harassment from communist officials. That is liberty. When artists, musicians, and writers can freely express their political opinions in song without fear of retaliation, that is liberty. When parents don't have to wait hours in line for basic staples like rice and beans just to feed their starving children, that is liberty. When the dying communist regime breathes its last breath, when a sovereign republic takes its place, And when separated families are reunited in a free Cuba, that is liberty. Mr. Chairman, the people of Cuba are looking to the United States for help and guidance. I look forward to working with you to answer their cries. Thank you, and I yield.
Congressman Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rosamarie, we often hear that the United States embargo is the primary cause of the lack of prosperity and democracy on the island. We hear that Cuban entrepreneurs would succeed only if they could trade and engage with their American counterparts. In previous testimony, you informed Congress, and I quote, "There cannot be free markets where there are no free persons." Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's actually a phrase of my father, and thank you so much for your words about him. And I think that the best answer to your question is coming from the Cuban people in the streets. They were not asking for the end of the embargo. They were asking for the end of the dictatorship. At the end of the dictatorship is a demand of the Cuban people. That's the demand alone, and that's the demand that we need solidarity to.
So just to make sure I heard you correctly, the people that are in the streets protesting, they're not protesting an embargo, they're protesting the communist regime that's in charge and a dictatorship over their country.
They have been shouting, change is possible, down with the dictatorship, no more fear, freedom, freedom, freedom. I think that's eloquent enough.
It is. Thank you. It's interesting that small fringe elements of the left here are trying to say that it's the embargo. But truth be known, it really has nothing to do with the embargo. If you look at 90% of the companies in Cuba, they're held by military holding companies, meaning the Cuban military runs 90% of the economy in Cuba. Well, there's a law in the United States that says an American company cannot do business with a Cuban military. So if we lift the embargo, we can't even do business with them. And where does the money go if 90% of the companies are held by the Cuban military? Well, it just empowers the dictatorship. This insane notion that lifting the embargo is going to somehow provide freedom for the Cuban people is crazy. It's absurd, and the only reason you would say that is unless you're trying to hide behind socialism and communism as an effective model. But everywhere else it's been in the world, it's been disproved. Let's look at North Korea. They can't get rice. They're starving. Remember the USSR in Berlin? They built a wall to keep their people in. And socialism, look at Venezuela. It is not the embargo, Mr. Chairman, that is causing the people of Cuba to suffer under this totalitarian dictatorship, and lifting it will only empower them. Cuba's egregious religious freedom violations are well documented, and they are widespread. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has called for global Magnitsky Act sanctions on the head of Cuba's Office of Religious Affairs, Cardio Diega, for her direct role in leading campaigns of repression against Cuba's religious communities. Can you both share examples of how the regime restricts and penalizes religion in policy and practice? Sir, if we could start with you.
The exercise of fundamental freedoms in Cuba depends on the degree of tolerance of the Cuban government. There is no rule of law in Cuba. There is a total concentration of power, no independent judiciary. The judiciary is under the subordination of the executive branch. If the government believe that is...
If I could interrupt you just a second. I think I understood you to say there's no rule of law, it's just total power concentrated in the hands of the dictatorship.
Exactly.
So how then, I'm going to flip back to my previous question, because you supported lifting this embargo. How then, if the total power is all in the hands of one individual, does lifting the embargo free the people? I don't understand.
Congressman Green, In foreign policy, you have multiple options. If you want to influence, if you want to have impact on the record of any given country. The option that you have chosen for over or close to 60 years is the isolation. That policy has bring no change in Cuba. I believe that
I would submit to you right now there's change happening. There are thousands of Cubans in the streets. There's a spotlight on the Cuban government. The world is crying for the internet to be open so we can see with transparency what's going on. We're at a point right now that may just be a great opportunity for two reasons. One, to show exactly what's going on in Cuba under this totalitarian dictatorship, happened because of the embargo. And two, to once again put another head of a communist dictator on the wall, and I mean that proverbially for all the people who are going to go out there and say Green is espousing some kind of violence. I am not. I am saying, but here's another failed communist regime. That's what I think. Two great opportunities. That system doesn't work, and we can free the Cuban people. And unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Green.
And thank you for the witnesses for willing to do a second round. One of my colleagues earlier commented that China was a good example where the U.S. has no embargo and inferred that because of that, it's proof or reason why we should lift the embargo with Cuba. I'd encourage those who are supporting lifting the embargo and citing China as proof to go and watch the video of the protesters in Hong Kong. Go ask the Uyghurs what it's like to live in China under the Communist Party of China. I'd like to ask you to go and talk to the churches in China where they're forcing them to take the cross down and replace it with pictures of Xi Jinping. The only other place in the world I can recall in my limited travels as a military officer and in running a not-for-profit is that where the president's picture is so ubiquitous is Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Go ask the Falun Gong folks what it's like to have your organs forcibly removed and sold. I don't see the lifting of the embargo making a huge change there in China. Ask the student or the researcher, how easy is it to search the internet in China? They don't call it the Great Firewall of China for nothing. So this notion that, lifting the embargo is going to make totalitarian dictatorships change overnight is just, it pales. I'm an ER physician, not a brain surgeon, so perhaps, maybe there's something I don't know, but I'm sitting here thinking, totalitarian dictators in the past, how many of them with open economic have actually stepped down from power and allowed for a republic to develop? I can't think of one in history. Question for Ms. Paya. There's strong international consensus for restoring Venezuela's democracy. People are working together. Countries are supporting us in our, actions there. Yet in Cuba, as Mr. Vivanco, am I pronouncing? Yep, has said they are doing in Cuba. We haven't gotten others to join us there. What is the difference? And this is just a genuine question. What is the difference, and why are they not helping with Cuba, but they seem to be very helpful with Venezuela and the socialist dictator down there?
Well, I think that's a question for the rest of the world, because what it is a reality is that tolerating 62 years of a communist dictatorship in the island of Cuba doesn't only affected several generations in my country, but has gravely and seriously affected the democratic stability of the whole continent. Actually, we wouldn't be talking about the collapse of the democracy in Venezuela without the support, the coordination, and the interference of the Cuban regime. Same thing with the repression in Nicaragua. And you know history, you know about the interference programs of the Cuban G2, well trained by the Stasi and the KGB in Latin America. So this in this pivotal moment that we are living as a nation that lives inside but also outside the island because of that dictatorship, our call for the international community is please see directly to the Cuban people, to the suffering of the Cuban people, and to the demand of the Cuban people. And that demand is freedom, and that demand is the end of the dictatorship, and that demand is not only going to help Cuba, but it's going to help peace and national security of our whole hemisphere.
Throughout the region, absolutely. It seems to boggle the mind that the world will join us to jump on Venezuela, but the folks that are actually, the Cuban military is in Venezuela. The Cuban military is helping Nicaragua.
Yes.
I mean, it just makes no sense to me that the rest of the world has joined us in this fight, and yet that seems to be the reason why it's failed, because we haven't gotten all the rest of the world involved, so let's just lift the sanctions. Makes no sense to me. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I want to thank you for your intensity. I think on both, everybody here is excited about the opportunity that we see at this moment in time. We're frustrated and angry with the human rights abuses that have gone on for so many years. And I agree that with the embargo not working, I think it's time to double down. I think it's time, and my criticisms aren't of the Biden administration per se as much about, earlier when I was talking about socialism and communism, and I was referring to sort of fringe members. I think we all know the senator I'm talking about who supports socialism, and my own colleagues here in the House who support socialism, and some who've advocated for universal rent control, which is right out of Karl Marx. I'm not saying that's the Biden administration. I'm saying my criticism there is just, let's act. It's time. And there's a chance, there's an opportunity to bring freedom to another group of people, and that's why I'm so passionate. But I believe very deeply that there's a lot of, I was listening to, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, who I don't agree with very often, but as she was talking about this, I'm like, yes, that's right. Those physicians are enslaved. And if they're doing that, they'll probably sell vaccine we give them anyway. Right? So, let's do what we can to continue to agree where we can. And Chairman Sears, I just want to thank you for your friendship and your unbelievable leadership on this issue over the decades. You are a champion for the people of Cuba because you are one of them. And you have done an amazing job leading through the challenges of a divided government here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for your time. Appreciate y'all.